Our next talk is a group presentation. It's Cybersecurity in a Large NSF Research Facility, One Institution's Approach. And our presenters are coming from Florida State University, and our first presenter is Julia Smith. Julia, welcome.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to this presentation. Over the next hour or so, we're going to give you an introduction to our institution's approach to cybersecurity at a large NSF user facility. The presentation will be delivered by myself. My name is Julia Smith, together with my coworkers Joe Brigham and David Butcher. And then in the second half, we'll be having a panel discussion where we will also be joined by our coworkers Jim Berhalter and Abigail Centers. All right, let me start by introducing our large-scale user facility. So we come from the National High Magnetic Field Laboratory, or short Magnet Lab. Our mission at that facility is to provide the highest magnetic fields and the necessary services and research equipment for researchers to make successful and cutting-edge experiments in our facility. That is for a wide range of disciplines. Think physics, chemistry, biochemistry, geology, material science research, you name it. And to do so, we developed the user facilities and the services associated with that. We advanced the magnet technology, so think about material science research, but also the engineering of the actual magnets. We promote a multidisciplinary research environment, and we also conduct educational outreach. What does our mission look like in practice? So the National Mag Lab has 7 user facilities that are spread over 3 sites. The site that we'll be focusing on today is the host institution, Florida State University, but there's also a site at the University of Florida in Gainesville and at Los Alamos National Lab. So what is essential to accomplishing our mission? Well, we believe that we need our world-class magnets, and we brought you a small selection displayed in the box at the bottom. So our latest and greatest hits are, for example, our 36 Tesla series connected hybrid magnet. That is a magnet that produces ultra-high, extremely steady fields. So that is important for biological research, for example, NMR. We also brought you the 41.5T Tesla resistive magnet. So that is a resistive magnet that it's really the highest resistive magnet in the world, producing fields for predominantly material science and condensed matter science research. We also have a 32T high temperature superconducting magnet. We have a 45.5 Tesla test coil, also high temperature superconductor, and as well as recent advances in pulsed field technology. Important to stress is that our science knows no boundaries. We have, for example, in 2019 serviced north of 2,000 individuals in our user facilities, and they come from about 300 institutions from all across the nation as well as the globe. So there is a lot of participation from all over the place, in person as well as remote participation. Introducing you to the Tallahassee site, you see an aerial view here. On the left-hand side, you see our resonance facility, so the ion cyclotron resonance facility, as well as the NMR facility. Then you see A, B, and C wing, where we have some smaller lab spaces, as well as office spaces. And then on the right-hand side, the DC field facility, where we produce the highest steady magnetic fields in the world. This facility is what the majority of this talk will be focusing on. And there you also see where our resistive magnets are housed, our hybrid magnets, as well as our physical plant with the large industrial style equipment that it takes to run our facility. Okay, so what kind of large-scale equipment does it take to produce these fields? To name a few, we have a magnet cooling water plant. It features a number of high-speed pumps, a water treatment system, heat exchanger, and 4 2,000-ton chillers. We have major power infrastructure. We're a 60-megawatt facility, which comes to about 8% of our local utilities capacity. We also have a cryogenics plant. We purify, compress, and liquefy our helium ourselves, and have a huge recovery effort going on there as well. Now, how does all of that tie together? This graph shows you how everything is interconnected and needs to work together to pull off excuse me, the user science that we do every day. If we start at the center, you see a box that says resistive magnets, so that is really the core of our facility running such a system. And as you can imagine, it takes a lot of power to run these magnets. Our magnets are 20, 30 megawatt systems, so we get power from our electric utility. We have an on-site substation and switchgear, transformers that step the voltage down from the incoming line to more manageable levels that we use in the facility, as well as a custom power system that puts out the DC fields, the DC power that we need for our DC fields. Depositing all this power in the magnet systems, we also have to dissipate that heat. So here comes the magnet cooling water system, which is a magnet cooling loop, which magnet cooling water pumps, heat exchangers, and excuse me. And a water treatment system. That cooling loop, in turn, is cooled by a chilled water system that depends on the 4 2,000-ton chillers, as well as chilled water storage basins. Just to give you a feel for the scale that we have here, the small one is about 1 million gallons of cooling water. The bigger one is 3 million gallons. And all of that is backed by our cooling towers. And of course, all of that equipment that I just talked about also needs electrical power to power it. Now, if we move to the slightly more complex systems, our hybrid magnets, so they are a resistive magnet surrounded by a superconducting magnet, and the two fields add up to get those ultra-high magnetic fields. We also need our cryogenics plant and all the equipment associated with that. Now, all of this equipment can be ran manually. However, the scale of our facility necessitates that we have remote and centralized control of these systems. So here comes the necessity for a distributed control system, and this is where cybersecurity comes in on our end. Now, what motivates us at this facility to look into cybersecurity? Well, we all know from the media and from your own work what can happen to large-scale facilities. And if we look at some of these media titles, our facility is not all that different from these people getting hit in these places. So that brings us to the challenges of protecting our facility and to our goal to protect personnel and equipment from the potentially disastrous release of stored energy. Because, for example, with a cyber attack, our controls, our protection systems could be compromised, or we could be externally taken over and somebody could be driving our facility. Challenges that come along with that industrial equipment is that we have operating systems and updates that could disable, like updates that are necessitated, but they could disable working software in our systems. We have the need for proprietary software updates, as well as a lot of vintage equipment, operating systems, and softwares that are not necessarily straightforward to update. Also, there really is a huge need for accessibility. So our industrial equipment control, for example, needs to be accessed by our instrumentation and control staff. And then there's our experimental equipment, which needs to be controlled by our scientific staff. We also have on-site user control of our magnets, so we actually let our visitors control the magnets themselves, as well as the other experimental equipment. We have the remote user participation that I spoke about, and we have remote access to data that is necessary, and we'll speak about that in great detail at the end of the presentation. Now, how does that look in practice? We brought one example for you, which is our 45 Tesla magnet, which is an ultra-high steady magnetic field in our facility. And if you look at that magnet, we show you a picture on the left-hand side. We have a magnet protection system that is part of our operational requirements, and the systems that I will speak about first are expert access only. So there's the magnet protection system, and there's magnet control. And the magnet control directly ties into our power system, the cooling plant, and the helium plant, which are those systems that could potentially release a lot of stored energy. All of that is controlled by our distributed control system, and for our expert operators and expert staff, local and remote access needs to be enabled. On the next layer, we have in-house staff requirements. So this is in-house user support scientists that need to be able to acquire data together with the users, but also need access to the magnet control. They need access to our in-house servers, as well as fair data storage, and also there's a need for local and remote access. Moving a step further, we have external user requirements, where, as we had said, there is remote and on-site user participation. These people use our equipment. Our users also bring in their own equipment, both for data acquisition as well as their own machines to do data analysis. So they need web access, but also acquisition access to our equipment as well as magnet control. All right, and that brings us to cybersecurity at the lab and my coworker, Joe.
All right, thank you very much. And before I begin, I also wanted to say this is my first time at Trusted CI. Learned a lot. It's really cool to listen to all of the shared experiences, I think might be the right word. And just very briefly, before I get into our journey, definitely a journey. My background is in biology and chemistry. At FSU, I work for the central IT organization. So one of our primary responsibilities is to support the Mag Lab, right? And that includes translating cybersecurity speak into the language that the researchers at the lab utilize. It includes building trust, right? It includes making sure that when we're talking about implementing, enhancing, improving our cybersecurity posture, we do that in a way that does not hinder the primary mission of the lab, right? Which is running their experiments, conducting research. So that's a really big deal to us. And in some of the presentations I was in yesterday, it really struck me, and it's not new, but if you don't mind, I'm going to repeat it, right? So managing risk and tolerating risk, because we can't manage all risk, is a huge part of what we're trying to accomplish. And in hearing just the previous session, talking about the cohort activity, one of my takeaways from the cohort is that you built trust and you built a collaborative environment, almost irrespective of the underlying framework that supported that process. Not to say that Trusted CI isn't great, right, in terms of building a security program. So what are we doing at the university, and how did we begin? So one of the things we did, working within the central IT group, is make sure that we all had a clear understanding of the various technology, right? Central IT groups historically are charged with administering administrative systems, enterprise systems, and there are management and ownership differences in those systems versus research environments, right? So in the organization as a whole, we have a CIO, we have a CISO. I actually work in the information security office at FSU. I work for the CISO. And so what we were trying to do is understand how to provide services that would assist the Mag Lab, but also not impose too many security constraints so that there were hindrances on critical mission-related operations. So big deal for us, and it's something that's ongoing. Second thing we did is, I'm kind of an old dog in the room, and I have a lot of experience using either what you might have heard of as the Purdue model or ISA 99. I know ISA 99 has been updated as well to deal with Internet of Things, devices, types of areas. But what we did is use this architecture to control and determine what controls were needed on enterprise systems that integrated at the MagLab, at MagLab enterprise systems at the very top, that's where the IT lives, and then down in the middle and down below is where the research technology and the operational technology lives. So we use this architecture to understand how to secure the various types of technology. And I walked in a little late this morning, but when Helen Patton was speaking, I absolutely agreed and aligned with the need to isolate administrative systems from experimental apparatus. And so that is the approach that we've taken architecturally. And so up and down that stack, we have conduits, if you will, interfaces, and those include people communicating with one another, but they also include technology. And so this type of architectural approach allowed us to think through the requirements that lived in the RT and OT spaces and levels, and it also allowed us to think through how we connected and what types of connectivity were needed to integrate enterprise systems for the lab as a whole and university-wide enterprise systems that FSU provides, okay? And what I didn't show in here in the diagram are the conduits, it's kind of busy enough, and the demilitarized zone that manages that type of access. But we have those types of technology in place. The other key point, and when I'd met Julia several years ago when we began this, is from the IT space, I think it always makes sense to think broadly, as was discussed earlier this morning, but to understand that there are no decisions that live in a vacuum. So when we're making technology choices, whether that be RT or OT, or whether that include information technology, they affect how we need to manage that technology from a cybersecurity standpoint. And by that same token, when we're applying trusted CI or some of the other best practices from NIST, from NERCI that we utilize at FSU, those have implications. And so we want to have that as a part of our thought process as we're building out our cybersecurity posture. So the university's approach with the MagLab and for our other research environments is to partner with and provide cybersecurity tools as a service. And that's one of my primary jobs in the research space, right, is to translate needs and requirements from a researcher, from a research team, for a lab as a whole, and to attempt to provide the tools and services that they can use to run their environment. So I've given you a sampling of some of the tools and services that we offer at the university. PKI, X509, certificate systems. We have enterprise processes for dealing with risk. We regularly assess those. We have a university-wide risk register. We have centrally coordinated business continuity, disaster recovery, and incident response procedures and templates. We have third-party risk tools. Most recently, we've developed a security reporting solution that takes information as a single pane of glass, if you will, and looks at reporting logs, security logs from infrastructure campus-wide, okay? And so these tools are available. They're a sample of what we provide, and we use them to try to provide support for the decisions that the lab needs to make to balance the need to mitigate a risk. Some risks are clearly more important and more dangerous than others, and to determine where to prioritize and where to invest our efforts. So that's a big part of our process, if you will, that we're trying to establish. Operationally, as Julia mentioned in her part of the talk, We have separations, firewall technologies that separate our OT and RT systems from our IT. We have secure access via a number of mechanisms, including MFA and VPN. And we isolate our most sensitive networks in the industrial area, especially where we have safety risk. So this is kind of a slide that we've used historically, and I think I'm going to go back home and update it after hearing about the Trusted CI assessment. But our focus has been on, when we engage a research team, taking an iterative approach, building capabilities that you can sustain. Those capabilities require resources. As many of us have talked about, cybersecurity is not free. They require people, it requires a budget, and it requires focus. So we've used a process that we call a readiness and gap assessment, not an audit. And we had developed that just before, I think, Trusted CI started to be published. And it covers the vast majority of the 16 musts in the 4 pillars. I think that in terms of the one-pager that has been referenced, the musts and pillars, I think there are some areas that we might be able to enhance our process, because I think the emphasis is on those musts. We have to have those things. So that's something that we're going to be going home and taking a look at. But the approach that we've used with a readiness and gap assessment is not to conduct an audit, right, as has been discussed earlier, but to establish a collaborative process. And to do that in a relatively short amount of time, and the way we've fielded that historically is by developing scopes of work that are on about 1.5 pages that hit on the majority of the musts that you include in Trusted CI. And so that's been very effective, and I've been on the tail end of audits. Those are never fun. And the good news is that the discrete prep tasks that you use in the process, even though we all want to complete, those prep tasks in themselves are valuable, that, as we've found, in terms of raising your security capabilities and your posture. So that's the approach that we've taken to try to start up. This is kind of my hot mess slide. And I think we all deal with this in large organizations in one way or another. And the source for this hot mess slide is based on some research that MIT did, Peter Wheel and Gene Ross. And it speaks to the types of decisions that need to be made and who needs to make them. And in the cybersecurity realm, we break that down into one vertical that you can call policies, standards, principles on the left. And then as you move to the right, we have decisions related to IT and OT infrastructure, architecture. Even though we have a current operation, we're not starting from scratch. We want to make conscientious choices in terms of how we enhance and grow that architecture. We have business applications along with all of the custom innovative tools and systems that the MagLab builds. And maybe farthest to the right, and most importantly, we're setting priorities. And priorities should align with our mission, and priorities should also drive budget, right? That's where we need to focus our resources. And so I think this slide, from my standpoint, is important because it speaks to the communication complexity in terms of how decisions are made. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal, some of them are advisory. And it's not always the IT group or the cybersecurity group that needs to make those calls, right? So we use this as a map when we're talking to leadership, and you can see where we've plugged in the various stakeholder groups at the lab in terms of how decisions in these domains, if you will, are made. And so we are working now to adapt this governance style, if you will, to the universities as a whole. And there's a lot of discussion on how to do that, right? And maybe it changes as we talk about it over time. But at the university, the Mag Lab is a very large component of our research environment. But we have centralized governance models that we establish as well. So in the cybersecurity realm and the information privacy realm, we have standing committees that we invite departments, colleges, research organizations to participate in. And then depending on the scale of those research organizations, they also need their own internal resources and structure. So we're working through how best to establish that governance at the university. Definitely an ongoing discussion. So I think with that, I'm going to turn over the remainder of the presentation to David Butcher, my colleague. I'm sorry.
All right, so now that Joe gave us the backbone of our approach, we also brought a couple of on-the-floor examples for you to show you how that pans out in practice. So throughout the lab, we have a number of embedded systems all over the place for data acquisition and equipment protection. The architecture that we show you in this slide has a development and deployment PC that we develop an application on, and it can be sent out in the field, deployed to our target in the field over the network. The target in this case is a compact RIO system, which features a field programmable gate array, as well as a Linux-based real-time operating system. And then there's a number of I/O modules that interface with the actual sensors in the field. And as you already can see from this rather simple architecture, security measures can be implemented at a lot of levels there. It could be the actual physical system, the operating system, the application, the network layer, and whatnot. And important to us is that we have a number of these systems with different goals and different tasks. It's very important to assess them individually and to find that balance between security and the ease of use, where often the ease of use translates into accessibility. So even more specific, we picked one of many of our systems, which is our power supply monitoring system. We already talked about that we're a 60 megawatt facility, so you can imagine that power is a big deal to us. So we constantly monitor the quality of our power with one of these compact RIO systems. We get at a very high rate information on the vitals of the incoming line power, our power supply system, and whatnot. And then we have an application, client application, that we hand out to staff so that people can check in and see what's going on in real time, and also the system writes data to one of our servers. So what are our security measures? Well, to start, very simple, the device is mounted in a locked enclosure in an area of the lab that is only accessible to qualified staff, so a small group of staff in the facility. Also, the device is firewall protected, and our remote access is limited to a TPC client and a web server. We also have TLS and SSL encryption. The web server access permissions are very strictly enforced. And also the client application is really limited, if you think about it, as a monitoring system. There is no way to actually control off of the data or take any decisions, automated decisions based off of the data. We distribute the app, the actual app, to the users as an executable, so limited ability to make changes there. Also, our TPC app requires password authentication. We have exhaustive training resources for staff. And also, whenever there is an update, we first run through whatever that is on our training system before we launch it in the field. Another aspect to this is our user experience. So what does network access in an actual magnet cell, so in an actual user external space, look like? Well, to start, let me explain that there is no Wi-Fi in the magnet cells because the Wi-Fi actually represents a source of experimental noise to the experiments. So all network access is hardwired, and we have split it up into 3 VLANs. So there's the visitor network, so that would be where external users and visitors are housed. They get web access, there's a couple of printers they can access, and they can access our specific data acquisition systems. One level up, so in-house user support staff. We have our DCMB, DC Field Facility Magnet Building Network, only internal staff, basically all the accessibility of the level down, but we also have access to file servers, more printers, and also remote monitoring, so that our user support staff can support our users in the middle of the night from home. And then there's our protected network, which is for a very small number of very specialized staff. This gives access to our distributed control system, which, as we talked about, controls our large-scale infrastructure, our power supplies, our chillers, pumps, electrical, and whatnot. Our magnet protection systems are on this network. The cryo plant, there is no web access, and everything is static IP and DHCP addresses only. Okay, the MagLab's network, past, present, and future. A lot of parts of the MagLab's infrastructures date all the way back to the 1990s. We have replacements in process, but that's a very big project. Also important, some of the very critical parts of our OT and RT are based on 1990s standards. And bringing all these systems up to current technology is a project that's underway, but it's a big project. On the bright side, a lot of our research technology is newer, from 2010 or newer. However, since we do not have infinite resources, we cannot afford to toss or set aside equipment just on the basis of cybersecurity. So basically in our facility, there is a lot of making it work going on until we can find the proper solutions and we can implement updates. Now, so what? Why does it matter? Well, our facility users expect a seamless experience. The people that come to our facility have competed for magnet time. They come for 1 week. They often wait months before they can come. There is research papers, there is graduate student theses depending on this data, and we do everything we can to make the experience as valuable as possible, also because it's pricey to provide these magnetic fields. So implementing a robust cybersecurity framework in a user environment has quite the impact on that experience. So what we have experienced is merging those needs of the research facility and the users with the cybersecurity actually takes a much greater level of institutional resources, so think people, time, and money than we have traditionally been allocated for these tasks. And with this, I would like to pass to David for fair data and open science at the MagLab.
Thank you, Yulia. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Butcher. I am the Fair Data Management Specialist at the MagLab, in addition to being a research faculty member in the Ion Cyclotron Resonance Department. I'm going to talk a little bit about fair and open science at the MagLab and how those subjects intersect with cybersecurity. So recently, the MagLab has significantly stepped up its efforts to ensure that all products of research, especially data collected by users of our facilities, are shared as widely and openly as possible. The catalyst for this effort has been the widespread recognition among both researchers and policymakers like the NSF of the benefits of sharing research data, and the understanding that that can be done most effectively following the principles of fair data and open science. And as many of you are likely aware, FAIR derives from the FAIR guiding principles for ensuring that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable for both humans and machines. And open in this context means anyone can freely access, use, modify, and share it for any purpose, according to the definition of the Open Knowledge Foundation. Guidance from the NSF, the NIH, the National Academies, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as many international organizations which don't fit here, all share the conclusions that applying those principles of fair data and open science can help to drive innovation, can help to facilitate replication, which ensures the integrity of the research, provide a greater return on investment for the publicly funded research that we do, and also just generally enable future reuse of the research data. As an NSF major facility, of course, we're very interested in realizing all of these benefits. And in pursuit of making our data fair and open, the MagLab has been working to review and improve its policies around data sharing for our 7 user facilities, including DC Field, which has been spoken about extensively. So even though the goal is to share the data openly, there are some concerns which make cybersecurity very important for user data. The user data can be subject to ethical and legal restrictions related to protection of patient privacy, as in the case of protected health information. There can be concerns about confidentiality and maintaining competitiveness of the research program. There could be concerns about national security, especially at our Los Alamos National Laboratory site. And some research data, especially that which contains protected health information, may never be able to be made openly available in its original form. A de-identified form may be possible, but that's a separate concern. Data also needs to be secured during its embargo period to give users adequate time to publish the results. The current policy in our facility-specific data management plans says that data collected for a user project should be made publicly available within 3 years of the last time that magnet time was assigned for that project, or within a year of publication of those results. So for those reasons, we need to make sure that the research products, especially the data, are being transferred and stored properly and are secure against cyber attack. One of the findings of the JSON report on cybersecurity at NSF major facilities that was mentioned earlier a couple of times said that, quote, NSF major facility data are to be openly shared. Confidentiality is not a primary goal. Now, I would disagree with that finding a little bit and just say that we need the data to be secure so that it can be released by the user in a proper and timely manner in a way that they decide. Keeping the data secure, as I said, is essential, but there's also a variety of complications for that. Here I've highlighted some of the major challenges of data security. The Open Science Cyber Risk Profile, which was also mentioned earlier and developed in part by Trusted CI, touches on some of these. First off, facilities at the MagLab often have specialized data management strategies. Due to the different types, sizes, and associated disciplines of data generated at the MagLab, there's no one-size-fits-all solution for data management and no one-size-fits-all solution for cybersecurity. As an example, last year I started to develop these data management maps to show the beginning and end points of data within the lab. For some of our facilities, these maps look radically different. The MagLab's internal file server is a common method used for data storage, but several facilities may have their own facility-specific data management servers or other strategies. Another problem is the scale and number of user projects at the MagLab. These are the most recent numbers we have from 2021. In 2021, which was a slow year due to COVID, we had 1,615 users representing 279 different entities, such as universities, government labs, and private companies. The numbers that Yulia showed earlier were from 2019, and we had over 2,000 users. So this is a very large-scale user program, and at least half of those were from the DC Field facility. So with those numbers, we can't really develop a risk profile for each individual user project to make sure that the data is being transferred securely and stored securely. Also, due in large part to that scale and diversity of user projects, we don't have the resources to carry out data stewardship on the behalf of users. So our current policy in our data management plan says that the ultimate responsibility for data stewardship lies with the user project PI. They are responsible for ensuring the security of all copies of MagLab data that leave the lab and the compliance of all collaborators with access to the data, not including MagLab collaborators that may be on a project. So because of that policy, PIs are free to utilize any local or remote storage solutions, data repositories, or other cyber infrastructure that may be available to them from anywhere around the world, anywhere they may be coming from, even if it's inherently insecure. On top of all that, widespread data sharing mandates that have come into play more recently are creating more vulnerability since data is being transferred more often to more endpoints, which inherently increases the risk. The days for researchers of data being transferred from the instrument to a single user-owned computer, analyzed and then published, and never released publicly are basically coming to an end. And for a lot of people, they have already come to an end. So all of this together means that as it stands now, many of the factors that determine the cybersecurity risk of the data are not in the MagLab's direct control. But we can still employ various strategies to mitigate the risks of data sharing. One of the most important measures we can take is to try to educate users. We can't fully mitigate user-related risks because, like I said before, the PI has the ultimate responsibility, but we can try to minimize them through that education. We can't make it mandatory, necessarily, but we can make it available, especially for early career researchers who make up a fairly large percentage of new MagLab users every year to help improve security on their end. We can also have a positive impact by directing our users to third-party platforms such as data repositories that have been vetted to the best of our ability. For example, the MagLab recently obtained a subscription to Open Science Framework, which is a platform for collaboration, data sharing, dissemination. OSF requires secure logins and encrypts the stored data, among other measures, to maximize the security. So we've designated OSF as our recommended generalist repository, but there are other great options out there like Harvard Dataverse, Data Dryad, and various others that have their own security measures. We also would like to be vetting discipline-specific data repositories, which are relevant to some disciplines in the MagLab and not others, by partnering with FSU's cybersecurity and taking advantage of the third-party risk management program that Joe mentioned earlier, as well as others. Our evaluations will also rely on documents like desirable characteristics of data repositories for federally funded research, which was released by the National Science and Technology Council's Subcommittee on Open Science earlier this year. As I mentioned before, we don't really have the resources to develop risk profiles for each individual user project, but what we have done and what we will continue to do is to develop risk profiles for specific facilities or specific types of experiments to identify those cybersecurity risks and attempt to mitigate them ahead of time, which also is covered under a program that Joe mentioned earlier, which was risk assessment and vulnerability management, which we can do with FSU Cybersecurity. We will continue to work to apply cybersecurity standards and frameworks such as Trusted CI, which along with the protection of personnel and equipment, which Julia mentioned earlier, will help to ensure the protection of privileged data, which is also an important goal for us. And then finally, along the way, we'll be working proactively with all of our host institutions, not just FSU, although we love FSU Cybersecurity, of course, but also Los Alamos and the University of Florida to address cybersecurity concerns, which can be different for facilities at different sites. And that's all we have. Thank you all very much.
All right, so this brings us to the panel discussion part of our presentation. We would like to start by offering to answer any questions you all may have in response to our presentation. If not, we can also kick off with some questions that we brought along.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. So my question was, I'm over here. Have you had any breaches or any incidents that you had to respond to?
As far as at the Magnet Lab, no. I take that back. We've had one, and it was many years ago, and it was, we got on it just like that. So, yeah, I mean, nothing major, nothing was lost.
So I was wondering on the fair data side of things, does MagLab have any policies, procedures, things around DOIs? I didn't see that mentioned there. That's something that OI is starting to try to figure out and grapple with. Do you kind of outsource that to Dryad and all those repositories? Do you have an internal process for DOIs and tracking these data so that you can claim some level of credit for them?
Yeah, we currently outsource all of our persistent identifier or DOI needs. That's one of the advantages of having an open science framework subscription, although you don't need a subscription to get that functionality. FSU also is a member of the DataCite Consortium, I believe, and so they could theoretically mint DOIs for us as well for specific purposes. But in general, right now, we want users, if they have a data set or something they want to share, to be assigning DOIs through the repository, because that's the easiest and most direct way to do it.
And then do they sort of report back to you and give you the DOIs, and just so that you can track it internally?
Yes, we have a reporting system for people to report publications to us so that we can know where the data wound up. And we're also expanding the functionality of that system to allow them to report data sets and other products of research as well.
Thanks. So I had a question actually also from your talk at the end. When you were talking about that the sort of responsibility ultimately lies with the PIs of the project. And I wondered if you had any thoughts or experience in terms of using backups for data availability or disaster recovery. Just because of thinking about similar experience or similar facilities we have where the data would be generated, and then it's the responsibility of the PI, where there may be sensible things we think they should do with backups, but maybe they don't take that advice. So I'm just wondering about your experience.
Yeah, this gets back at the slide I had about specialized data management strategies. So some facilities have their own backup plans in place. For instance, my department, ion cyclotron resonance, we have a backup server that's just for our data. Other facilities have similar measures, and then a few facilities rely on the MagLab's internal file server, which is managed by our computer support group and Jim Berhalter, which has its own backup mechanisms in place. It gets backed up to tape periodically, right?
Right. So, I mean, like what David's talking about is they have a RAID array that they back up a lot of their data to, all their data to. And they have their own separate array because of the mass amounts of data that they're backing up. But it is all backed up to tape, and we are actually in the process of buying some offsite storage to be able to get it out of the building. I mean, we just have lots and lots of data, and with that just comes, big bucks. It's super expensive. But yeah, most of the facilities are mostly on the same plan. There's a central file server. We back it up. All the endpoints are backed up out into the cloud. Virtual machines are backed up out of the cloud. It's mainly the file server that's backed up on site, just because it's expensive.
Right, and just to be clear, users don't have access to our internal file server. Now, we could provide them a backup theoretically from our copy if we have a copy of their data, which we don't always have. But it's really for internal use only. So backing up their own data is also effectively the user's responsibility. We are there kind of as a safety net just in case.
Disaster recovery versus, whoops, I forgot this file.
Right, exactly.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, just so you know, like a lot of users that come in, especially into the DC field, they'll bring in all of their own equipment, take all their own data on their own equipment, and then leave with it. We never see it. So we don't even have the option for any sort of DR or anything else like that.
There we go. Well, that second part just kind of ruined my question, but that's okay. I'm starting with the premise that one of the great things about DataCite is that it has basically helped to fundamentally establish the metadata fields, which we commonly use because all of the repositories that you've mentioned, Dryad, Zenodo, Figshare, OSF, others, basically rely on that. And then, of course, you have schema.org and the Google Dataset Search. So all the way back to the days of Dublin Core. The reason your question, your response ruined my question was I was going to ask, so if the data products coming out of the lab are in structured enough formats, have enough kind of commonality to it, have you considered providing a metadata file and potentially scripts and other tools to say, hey, we know who you are, we know when you collected the data, we have this instrument information, here's a text file, a JSON file, whatever flavor you like of XML, and here's something, a tool that you can go and get a credential from one of these various repositories and do your ingest. Or is it all the case that, you know what, the data comes out and it's just a damn mess, and we don't want to get into it?
Yeah, we have considered metadata standards, data packaging, all these things. We have a lot of great ideas about what we'd love to do, but we don't always have the resources to execute on it. We do have one facility at Los Alamos, our post-field facility. They've developed their own bit of data acquisition software which incorporates metadata from various internal sources like our user proposal system, our calendar, the actual data itself from the data acquisition software, and packages it into an open science framework project. I don't believe they have incorporated a particular metadata standard like it's something based on schema.org yet, but that's functionality we've considered for the future. But before we can get to all that, we need to make the baby steps of just getting users to routinely get their data up and open. So that's step one. This is not going to be a short-term sprint. This is a marathon, at least in my view.
So I'm curious if data integrity is a concern to researchers. It's just something that's just not really in the picture.
Integrity in terms of the integrity of the research data.
Yeah, I mean the data has been taken. You want to make sure that there's it's trustworthy. So you do hashing. I'm not sure if the size makes that impossible, but when it's created and then basically through the life cycle. I don't know, I know it's not done very commonly, but I'm just wondering if that's something that's considered as part of cybersecurity yet.
I really don't know. I would imagine that it is. I would imagine that behind the scenes there's hashing and various other processes being carried out to ensure that a file is maintaining its integrity. But that would be more the responsibility of the repository, and not something we would be doing ourselves.
And if I may add, that is one of the functional needs that we're looking at relevant to Harvard Dataverse. So those capabilities are there.
Okay, I'm going to politely disagree. I believe that you should provide a file manifest with checksums to your users when you deliver your data. The Baggett protocol, there's plenty of ways out there, but I do feel that that's one of the things. As a data provider, one of the ways you can instantiate the chain of integrity is by saying, here are your files, and by the way, here is a text file that says this is the data that we're giving you. That works exceptionally well down the line.
Absolutely, and Baggett is one of the integrated components in Dataverse.
Yeah, again, we try to outsource as many of these different functions as we can because there are experts, programmers who work on this kind of thing at the repository level or external to MagLab. We don't really have the resources right now to be doing that. Now, we could institute something like adding MD5 checksums or hashes in a basic text file in an automated fashion. That wouldn't be too hard to do. So that is something we should probably look into. Unless they're taking their own data on their own system. Again, that's a major limitation that we face.
Yeah, it's very, very common that nobody at the Magnet Lab ever sees any of the data that's being done. They come in, they take it, they go. So, I mean, it is a hotbed of conversation about whether we should even let them do that anymore. But then, I mean, that poses so many other problems as far as, are they even going to come to the lab and to do science because they can't use their own systems? They're stuck using ours. If they've got a way that they want to do it in their realm, they can't do it. So,
Thanks. I'm curious, on the fair and open data side of things, do you require your users to authenticate in order to be able to access data, and do you track that usage?
Well, if we want the data to be open, one of the principles behind that is that authentication really shouldn't be required at the time that the data is made fully open, assuming it can be. You do need to authenticate yourself if you want to be able to get access to upload data to a repository. But that's not usually a complicated process. They don't do a whole lot of, checking your identity or verifying it in any meaningful way. But yeah, if the data is going to be open, there shouldn't be authentication involved. That's the idea.
What else? Other questions?
One more for you. So how do you guys approach insider threat concerns? Is it just another part of, just a component of your cybersecurity implementation?
Repeat that.
How do you approach insider threat concerns? Is it just another component of cybersecurity? Is it something, do you focus on that at all? Or is it not really a concern with the type of work that you do?
So maybe I can start. Definitely a part of our security awareness training. That's a big part of it. For privileged access systems, we're tracking what's happening in those systems through log mechanisms and other mechanisms.
yeah, and as far as visiting scientists go, like say in the DC magnet building, they are plugging into a completely separate network. They do have access to the web and a very small like about 10 systems inside the building. It's there's a firewall in between. It's pretty well firewalled off. We've had discussions about like if you remember the picture that showed DCMB network, visitor network. Should the DCMB network have a lockbox around it? Well, now you're getting into the social part of it of, well, now I got to remember where the keys are and these kinds of things. And because we have researchers there sometimes all throughout the night. Now you've got to worry about somebody policing it and all of that. So now you're talking about more staff, more money, more all of that. So.
All right.
Thank you all.